Alright, so another theoretical video, and this is about using references and how important it is. And one of the reasons I want to put this video in is that I'm not actually doing it enough in the course because I was a bit too lazy to edit to all the videos where it would make sense. So at least create one video about it. References are extremely important in the job as an FX2D. So of course what makes sense is you use it as an inspiration, but more importantly actually it's that you're learning from reality about things that you're not aware of. And it's actually surprising how many things you're not aware of. Then it helps you to actually define the goals. It's actually tricky to just do something that is based on a simple explanation like snow, because then you start to chase a moving target because, you know, what snow is or what it means can change depending on your mood in the detail. And you might go with something that looks better than others. So defining explicitly what you're trying to achieve is extremely helpful to even being able to make decisions. And finally, very important in this industry, this is a visual industry. So what we are creating are not Houdini setups. We're not creating XR file sequences. The reason this industry exists is to create visual results that we can show other people and they will pay us for it. So that means we need to use a visual medium to communicate with each other because that's the whole point. You cannot describe an effect. At the very least for communication, you can't get around references. So as I said, the first thing is learning from reality. Let's go a bit more specific about this. It's actually surprising how little you realize what's happening around you, because your brain, you probably have heard this before, is filtering out, I don't know, 95% of everything that happens around you so that you can focus on the most important things. But that means a lot of the things you're not even realizing. And I have an example for this. If I tell you to draw a toaster out of your head, you will see that you will, of course, remember the most important things. You know, there's an area where the toast go in and there's something that you pull down to start the, toasting process. But if you actually then compare this to a real toaster, you realize that you forgot all kinds of small details. So, for example, there is a controller for how dark your toast should be. There's a stop button. There's, of course, the name of the company on the toaster. There are all kinds of security text that you constantly ignore, and including of some instructions next to some, parts of your toaster. Also, what you can't see here is, there's a little thing that you can take out to get rid of the crumbles and all that. Don't forget what's actually missing here is a cord that you put into the socket so that this damn thing is actually working. So all kinds of things. And in simple terms, you can just say reality is complex, way too complex to remember it all. So never do anything from your head. So to give you an example of this, if you are supposed to, let's say, create some steam from a hot cup of tea or coffee, then you would think from your experience, okay, it probably behaves like water steam, right? So something like this. But if you actually would have looked at references like a good FX2D, you would have noticed that steam of, hot coffee is actually not behaving like that for all kinds of reasons. It's actually looking a bit more like cigarette smoke if you look at it. And here's another example of that. It's a bit hard to see, but you understand what I'm coming from. It does not look like this. It behaves differently. And there's no way to know this unless you actually look at some reference. Here's another example, fireworks. This is actually something that I had to do once. And what you notice is if you at first it seems like something you're familiar with, but if you actually look closely, what's actually really important here is the smoke that is left over after the explosion, because this is what gives a fireworks explosion the glowing feel and is an essential part of the overall look. Here's another example of this. If you now look specifically for it, you can see how important the smoke actually is. The whole glowing of the night sky and the nice, the whole, feeling of it comes actually, to a big extent at least, from the smoke. Not from just the burning stuff that is obvious, but it travels through the smoke and illuminates it, and this is what actually is a big part of the whole thing. Another important thing is understanding the goal in the first place. And I had this example as well. We were supposed to create a hummingbird. And it's actually pretty hard to pin down what a hummingbird is, because do you want this hummingbird, or do you want this hummingbird, or maybe this hummingbird? So it's not even clear what the goal is if you can't even find an objective definition of a hummingbird. There are all kinds of different hummingbirds, and everybody might have a different idea what that means. And there's absolutely no way starting this project without having one specific reference that you can rely on and say, okay, this is how I want this to look like. And finally, communication. This is very important because it's always teamwork. So even though right now maybe you're the only person on your projects, later on this will definitely not be the case. At the very least, even if you will be working by yourself, which is very unlikely, you will at least have a client. And you should demand references from your client so that you understand what actually is the expectation. For example, many clients use words like splash, for example, or a splashy feel to something. And what that means to them is very specific to what they have in their head and might be completely different to what you imagine under it. So is that a splash? Or maybe this is meant with a splash, or maybe even a powdery, explosion or something can in some people's mind be a splash. So it's really hard to communicate with words alone when you work on a specific visual medium. So make sure you're not communicating without communication. Words are meaningless. They always have to be explained in a visual way in this industry. And this is why references are essential when working with effects. So what that means in the end is you should always start any project with collecting references. This is what I do as well. That's the very first step. Before I open Houdini, I'm always very clear what I want to achieve because I already spent some research time by collecting references. When you do this, one tip, make sure that in the beginning you collect as much as possible. Because, you want to have as much inspiration and ideas as possible. But once you're done with that, I would highly recommend to drastically filter your references. This is something I see with students all the time. They come up with, 10 different references and all of them are different. And this is not helpful because you then have still the same problem. Okay, which one is the actual reference? The fact that you like all those 10 references is not helpful. That's not the idea. The idea is to know exactly what you want to achieve. And this very often results in one single video or picture after you researched hundreds of those. And this is totally normal and it's correct. Make sure that your final reference is filtered drastically at the end to a very specific single thing that you could show someone else so that he or she understands exactly what you're trying to achieve. And the second tip is, as you have seen here, I only used references from reality. Sure, actually they were from the great website Pexels.com and Unsplash.com, which provide a lot of free content. And no, I'm not getting paid by them. I just find them absolutely amazing for reference work. But all of them were actually recorded from reality. So I'm not a massive fan of using other movies or other CG results as a reality, because then what you do is you create a copy of a copy of a copy. Sure, sometimes that's okay, especially if a client has a very specific reference in mind from something that he or she saw. But in most cases, you should always look for references from reality, because then you have the pure thing in front of you that you can analyze and especially make it your own. Nobody wants to see something that they have seen 10 times before. They want it to be somewhat unique, and also it makes it more believable if your reference is actually from reality, obviously. Let's say you wanted to create the fire from a dragon, and unless your client already gives you a reference, I would always think about, okay, what is the closest to that in reality? For example, a flamethrower, and I would analyze that instead of, looking at some fantasy version of a dragon, because you will get a more believable result and maybe even get new ideas. So always go with references from reality if that's possible first, and secondary sources should only be necessary if there's no alternative to it. So a little bit of a theoretical video once again, but I think that's very important to understand. Never underestimate the importance of references as an effects artist or TD. So thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.